welcome. I would like to very warmly welcome to this event as part of the Center on Law and Social Transformation here in Bergen, to today's event on sexual violence and the ongoing war in Ukraine. I would very much like to thank Fridur for funding this event as part of our Transitional Justice Seminar Series. And very warmly, I would like to welcome our whole panel. I'm very, very grateful to welcome all of you here to this event. And I would like to start off with welcoming Kateryna. Kateryna Busol is a Ukrainian lawyer specializing in international humanitarian and criminal law. She is a national consultant on transitional justice and prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence at UN Women in Kiev in Ukraine, where she consults the Ukrainian parliament and government, among others. Being a consultant for the Global Survivors Fund, she recently contributed to the fund's report on opportunities for reparations for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. Welcome, Kateryna. Next, I would like to welcome Yuliia. Yuliia Ansonova is an independent researcher and currently works as a lawyer for Strada, Ukraine, which is a public human rights organization working to ensure gender equality, peace building, and prevention of genocide, prevention of gender-based violence. Sorry. As part of this work, she specializes in the fields of gender-based violence, including sexual violence and domestic violence, human trafficking, and gender discrimination. Welcome, Yuliia.
Thank you.
And then I would like to welcome here on stage this event's discussant, Anna Gopsill. Anna is a PhD candidate in human rights at the School of Advanced Study at the University of London. Her research centers on sexual violence against men and boys during war and genocide, and how the international community have understood, confronted, and legally approached the crimes. As an historian, her particular research focuses on the cases of Bosnia-Herzegovina and Rwanda. And Anna is also affiliated with the Center on Law and Social Transformation. Just as a brief disclaimer, we know this topic is quite sensitive as it is an ongoing conflict, and as the topic of sexual violence in general is quite sensitive. So please feel free to leave the event anytime in case you feel uncomfortable. And I would also very much like to thank Kaja Brun. Maybe you can indicate yourself quickly. Kaja Brun is a clinical psychologist, and she is working at the Center for Migration Health, which is a service for refugees and asylum seekers of the Bergen municipality. And we asked her to be here in case any one of you feels uncomfortable, would like to talk to her either during the event or after the event. She will be here during the whole event and a bit afterwards. So feel free to just approach her whenever you would like to be. Thank you so much for being here, Kaja. So that much from my side first. I would like to give word then to Anna as our discussant, and I'm very excited to have this event now, and I'm very curious about this whole discussion.
Thank you, and I'd like to reiterate my thanks to all of you for being here, and also for the panelists for participating in this very sort of important and timely event that we have today. So as Dorothee mentioned, I'll just provide a very quick overview to the topic and a bit about the motivation behind organizing what we're doing now. So as the war in Ukraine continues to unfold, we see disturbing stories of suffering that have been reported by media across the globe. One aspect of the conflict that is increasingly under scrutiny are reports of sexual violence and rape leveled at Russian soldiers by Ukrainian civilians. These accounts of sexual violence and rape have received increasing attention since the first reports sort of came out in early April of this year. Additionally, verified reports of sexual violence against men and boys are emerging. However, the UN has warned that the current knowledge we have about sexual violence in Ukraine represents only the tip of the iceberg, and it is likely that more reports will emerge during the duration of this war. Harrowing reports of women and girls being subjected to gang rape, threats of rape, forced nudity, and other forms of sexual violence have emerged. And as such, it's crucial in this context to remember that sexual violence is not just rape and accounts for a number of different forms of violence. We also know that men and boys have been subjected to sexual violence in detention centres, prisons, and other locations. This violence has included acts of genital mutilation, forced nudity, beatings, and other crimes. Looking at the patterns of atrocity being perpetrated across the country paints a very worrying picture about the nature of the continuation of violence in Ukraine. Here it's important to highlight that the majority of known cases of sexual violence have been perpetrated by Russian soldiers against Ukrainian civilians. In cases such as these, perpetrators often go to great lengths to hide evidence of violence, and survivors are often scared or ashamed to speak out. Some initial steps have been made towards documenting the ongoing atrocities in Ukraine. For example, the ICC recently opened an investigation to look into the ongoing atrocities in the region since 2013. And the UK and the US, among other countries, have sent independent investigation teams to find out what is going on the ground. So there are fact finders on the ground already. However, what they are finding is quite murky and difficult to verify. As such, there are no concrete numbers available of how many women and girls are subjected to this violence, but we do know that the violence is extremely widespread. Indeed, as is the case with conflict-related sexual violence more broadly, we will probably not know the true extent and nature of the atrocities for some time. Another key issue here is that there's no one concrete definition of what sexual violence is, meaning that different fact finders, institutions, and agencies are accounting for and recording sexual violence in different ways. Sexual violence in Ukraine is not a new issue, and this violence has been ongoing in regions of Ukraine since 2014, as Kateryna will discuss in just a moment. However, there's been some escalation in the violence since February 2022. It's also important to remember that sexual violence forms but one part of the overall violence being perpetrated in Ukraine, and forms an overall regime of gender-based violence in the country that has been continuing since. I'd like to now hand over to Kateryna, who will provide more of an overview of sexual violence in the country and sort of provide some more historical analysis of the violence that's being perpetrated. So thank you, Kateryna.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, and thank you very much for holding an event on this very poignant issues, because so much debate is focused on what threshold sexual violence has reached, whether it is being used in Ukraine as the method of warfare, whether there is a genocidal intent manifested through the patterns of sexual violence. But while these discussions are important, what is no less important is to first hold them in a survivor-sensitive manner, and I will comment on how it is not the case now, unfortunately, first. And second, to remember what the colleagues have just very subtly underlined, that these patterns have been there, albeit on a smaller and different region-wide scale, in the Russia-Ukrainian conflict since 2014. And the lack of action in terms of both accountability and prevention since 2014 has in a certain way contributed to the scale of sexual violence and other conflict-related violations that we're witnessing after the full-scale invasion. In my presentation, during the next 7 minutes, I would want to focus the discussion on 3 principal premises. First, I will address the patterns of sexual violence in the Russia-Ukrainian conflict between 2014 and the full-scale invasion. Second, I will comment on how these patterns have escalated and transformed after February this year. And finally, I will comment, hopefully, with a more light-given perspective on Ukraine's transitional justice efforts and the emphasis which Ukraine, even before the full-scale invasion, put on conflict-related sexual violence and the wider gendered approach to peacemaking in both helping the survivors and sewing the nation back together after the armed conflict. Now, to start with 2014, this is how I start any conversation on Ukraine, that this is important to point out that Russia's aggression started in 2014 with the occupation of Crimea and with Russia's direct and proxy presence in Ukraine's eastern territories of Donbas. And since the very beginning of the armed conflict in both of those localities, different allegations of sexual violence emerged. Different human rights groups reported the use of sexualized torture with respect to pro-Ukrainian civil society members, journalists, and generally Ukrainian citizens in occupied Crimea. The reporting in Crimea was further impeded by the fact that many pro-Ukrainian activists there are Crimean Tatars, they're Muslims, and for them culturally and religiously that would an additional layer of difficulty on top of this like rigid masculinity argument to report this type of violation. So for them it was easier, and Ukraine is not being an exception here, for these especially male survivors was easier to report torture in detention rather than the sexualized aspects of that torture. And I would want to also point out the additional gender dimension of these crimes is that the Crimean Tatar families are they're indigenous people and they're very traditional. So usually it's a man who is a breadwinner, whereas it's a wife who takes care of the household, of the elderly, and usually of a big family of 2 or 3 kids. And so when these men are being unlawfully detained and subjected to sham trials, for instance, the Russian NGO, famous NGO, International Memorial, has also recognized many Crimean Tatars as political prisoners. Their imprisonment, and it has the wider reverberations for their families, and these reverberations are gendered, because the females who would usually be taking care of the household, they had to become active breadwinners and family caretakers because their husbands were in jail. That would also leave, of course, many kids without the paternal care and without the maternal care, which they're usually used for. And this gender dimension of unlawful detention and of sexual violence in detention so far has not been addressed enough by Ukraine's government in transitional justice framework, but on that I will comment later. As regards the eastern territories of Donbas, both human rights groups, for instance, Amnesty International or Ukrainian NGO, Eastern Ukrainian Center for Civic Initiatives, that have worked targetedly on analyzing sexual and gender-based violence in eastern Ukraine, as well as the UN in its so far the only specialized report on sexual violence in Ukraine's armed conflict between 2014 and 2017, have singled out several patterns and localities of sexual violence in eastern Ukraine. So first, they singled out the places of unlawful detention in the so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Usually people there would be subjected to sexualized torture, to rape, threats of rape aimed both at them and at their family members, especially female family members, as well as making the unlawfully detained people watch torture or sexual violence directed at another unlawful detainee. In my work with the survivors mentioned by the colleagues in the research on their needs for reparations that we conducted jointly with the Global Survivors Fund, this report is available online. Many survivors would indicate that for them, witnessing sexual violence or hearing the threats of sexual violence was sometimes harder to bear with than experience violence themselves. And this, I think, is something which is very important to note also for any criminal justice professional engaging with helping such victims, and also engaged understandably in according the terms of punishment to alleged perpetrators. As regards other localities for eastern Ukraine, the so-called gray areas along the contact lines where the territories where sexual violence was reported, in particular women who had to cross the checkpoints between the government-controlled and non-government controlled territories, spoke about both sexual harassment and different instances of sexual violence that they had to consent to sex in order to be able to cross to one territory or to the other. And the occupied territories as such as well were understandably not a safe haven. In their report on unlawful detention in Ukraine last year, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission also pointed it out at the alleged use of sexual violence or threat of sexual violence in certain places of detention by Ukrainian forces, especially by the security service of Ukraine. So far, Ukraine has responded that they were investigating these cases, but the results of these investigations remain to be seen. By and large, it appears that the larger amount of violations was perpetrated by Russia and Russia-controlled armed groups, both in occupied Crimea and in Donbass. But the lack of the reporting of these crimes, the lack of specialized investigative strategies, and just to give you an illustrative example, Ukraine as a state, its Office of the Prosecutor General and Specialized Prosecutor's Office, as well as the very active human rights community, the leading human rights organization, including the Nobel Peace Prize laureate of this year, the Center for Civil Liberties and Human Rights, have sent numerous communications to the ICC on alleged crimes against humanity and war crimes to convince the court to open a full-scale investigation, which, as you know, was not opened with respect to Ukraine only until March this year. But despite the huge number of such communications, the first governmental communication on conflict-related sexual violence was only being prepared in 2021. So that shows you, A, the problem of reporting, the problem of investigative strategy, and of course, the problem of the lack of action on behalf of the government on this type of violence and victimization. And these issues escalated with February this year. The major change with February this year was twofold. First is the geographical scope of conflict-related crimes. Understandably, the whole territory of Ukraine became the battlefield and the crime scene. And second, the scale of patterns of sexual violence crimes has also changed. For instance, the UN Commission of Inquiry, also kindly mentioned by my colleagues, in their recently issued first report on Ukraine, has said that victims from 4 to over 80 years old were subjected to sexual violence. Women, men, children, and the elderly people were subjected to sexual violence. And again, this was not the case before the full-scale invasion. The majority of victims were both women and men, both civilian and prisoners of war, but usually they were adult people. Only some elderly victims were known. As of now, the age group of victims is very big. Second, the patterns of sexual violence, which included rape, gang rape, I'm commenting the Commission, UN Commission of Inquiry, the patterns of sexual violence, which include rapes and gang rapes in occupied territories, were often accompanied either by the killings of the family members or by making the family members watch sexual violence against their family members. And the first reported case of a woman from the Kyiv region who was who was repeatedly raped by 2 Russian soldiers, also has a prehistory to these 2 soldiers killed her husband. And reportedly, she said, when she asked them what they had done to her husband, they said they had killed him because he was a fascist. So this increased use of hate speech, and the speech which could possibly also be characterized as genocidal speech, is also something which became increasingly widespread in this post-February 2022 period. Finally, as regards both the patterns of crimes and its perception by its reporting to the public and its perception by the public, it is important to note that as I mentioned, both women and men are now victims of sexual violence in Ukraine, and both civilian women and men and prisoners of war. And the problem with reporting and seeing the sexual violence, its different types, it's still there. And again, I refer back again to the kind introduction by my colleagues who mentioned that it's important to also clearly figure out what types of violations we regard as sexual violence. Because, for instance, when upon the first prisoners of war exchange, the major prisoners of war exchange that included Ukrainian service women, they were showed with their hair shaved off, and it was commented by the government that they had been made undress and squat in front of a Russian and apparently Belarusian service people who were holding them captive. And that was not articulated well enough, that forced nudity, that holding in captivity in highly discomforting and threatening circumstances by the members of the opposite sex of the hostile army was also a form of sexual violence. So this perception that sexual violence is only in form of rape and usually victimizes only women, unfortunately still dominates in Ukraine. Now I turn to my third bit of the presentation as regards the transitional justice steps which Ukraine has made and what place the sexual violence and gender dimensions have there. Ukraine has been elaborating its transitional justice roadmap since 2019. It hasn't been public, but its authors who submitted the roadmap to the president for the presidential approval has said that they have pointed out a specific list of under-investigated crimes, and sexual violence was among them. They also pointed out that survivors have to be involved not just as the beneficiaries of transitional justice policy, but its co-shapers, which is important, which is in line with UN standards of survivor-centered justice. The problem is that, of course, so far, both because of this level of policy, the stage of policy making, and because of the full-scale invasion, the government has not proposed an outreach strategy, how to, in practice, reach out to survivors and say that we want the specific groups of survivors of different age, gender, regional locality, as well as type of victimization, come up and contribute to both pointing what aspects of transitional justice policy they would want to see, and especially how they want the reparations and the prevention policies look like. So this outreach strategy to survivors is something which remains to be seen. And finally, as regards reparations, something that is very important to survivors, although still, even after the full-scale invasion, accountability remains the top priority among the reparations. But of course, we should remember that there are other needs, such as the needs in housing, in sustainable medical and psychological care, as well as the help with the professional re-qualification and education opportunities. So survivors, especially those coming from unlawful detention centers in Eastern Eastern Ukraine. They did receive certain one at a time financial help amounting at the time to 3,000 euros. But of course, first, that was not holistic. Only survivors of unlawful detention received that help. B, there was still a rather protracted procedure of receiving that help. And C, obviously now the number of victims has increased. So Ukraine should really focus, and its international partners should really focus not only on ensuring the very important accountability steps, but also in working more on individual reparations, which should be available not through the tedious and long court procedures, but also through simplified administrative procedures and through interim procedures. And indeed, the experiences of many other conflict-affected nations, Congo and Cote d'Ivoire, say that this is how it should be, especially for such vulnerable victims. I will stop here and I'll be happy to respond to your questions soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kateryna. I think you really highlighted the different patterns of violence that we've been witnessing in Ukraine, and also reminded us of the importance of approaching this violence in a survivor-centered manner, rather than from the top down. And it was also very interesting to hear about the sort of lack of investigatory strategies, which is definitely something I think we'll return to in the Q&A later. I'd like to remind you all that you are welcome to ask questions at the end. So if you do have any questions for Kateryna, then we will come back to a sort of discussion at the end of the seminar after we've heard from Yuliia as well. So now I would like to hand to Yuliia, who will present to us a bit about her work with Strada Ukraine. And I believe she has a presentation to share. So just bear with us 1 second while we get that on the screen.
Thank you, Anna. I have shared my presentation already. Please tell whether you can see it.
We're getting there, I think. I can see some work at the back of the room, so. Yeah, we can see it now, Yuliia. Thank you.
Perfect. I will start. And first, I should notice that I'm a researcher and my area of specialization is conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine. However, today we'll be talking from the perspective of practitioner and in particular on what my organization, Strada Ukraine, is doing in order to assist the victims of conflict-related sexual violence. So to begin with, I introduce our the main work our organization is doing. So basically, we are operating two national hotlines. First is a national hotline on prevention of domestic violence, human trafficking, and gender discrimination, and second is a national hotline for children and youth. And through these hotlines, we have an opportunity to provide consultations to the victims of different kinds of gender-based violence, but among them also victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And I also want to highlight the importance of this type of assistance to the victims, because as my colleague Kateryna previously mentioned, victims often prefer not to report what happened to them due to the fears of breach of confidentiality. And since our hotlines are anonymous, we are positioned in a way to to be contacted and to be reported these cases more openly. So very briefly on what our hotlines are doing, they provide free consultations 24/7. They work through the phone number and also through social media, such as Telegram, Instagram, and Facebook. They work based on principles of anonymity and confidentiality, meaning that we do not gather information, personal information of victims, and this is a little bit different compared to some national services, including national hotline, which is not does not provide the full confidentiality in the way that we do. Also, the types of consultations we provide are informational, psychological, and legal. also our hotline, both of our hotlines are part of the national referral mechanism, meaning that once survivors contact us, we can refer them to other specialized services which they might require, and also to law enforcement agencies for reporting the crimes. Also, Strada Ukraine, through hotlines and also outside the work of our hotlines, we publish different methodological, analytical, and informational materials, including for the survivors of the conflict-related sexual violence, and I will refer to it later in my presentation. And also, we can through our hotlines we conduct surveys in order to monitor the situation in real time and trace the main tendencies in the patterns of gender-based violence in Ukraine. And turning to more specifically to the conflict-related sexual violence direction of our work. Starting from February 24, 2022, we received overall 24 calls reporting 30 victims of conflict-related sexual violence. And here I should mention that since our hotlines operate in Ukraine for more than 20 years already, of course, we received calls also starting from 2014 about cases of sexual violence related to conflict. However, the numbers of these cases were not that big as we have now. And also, as Kateryna mentioned, the patterns of the violence were different during that time. This number of victims, of course, it's not it does not point to any numbers like actual scale of this violence in Ukraine. It's just the victims who contacted our hotline and who reported specifically that they suffered from this kind of violence. Also, I should mention that since mostly victims are reluctant to report, there might be much more cases of victims reaching us, but on the other issues, so not reporting the cases, the specific issue directly. And in this statistic, we also did not include child witnesses of conflict-related sexual violence because, according to Ukrainian legislation, this means that they are also victims of such violence. So it's mostly victims directly affected by such violence, and mostly it included rapes by Russian military. So among other forms of sexual violence, which might be which might take place. We here we refer mostly to the cases of rape. Although we also received reports about, for example, sexual harassment in bomb shelters. We also received information about sexual harassment in territorial defense units, but these cases are not included into the statistics. Also, as for the composition of survivors, cases were reported against women, men, girls, and boys. And here I want to highlight, for example, such fact that in the report of the Office of High Commissioner on Human Rights, they did not report cases, they did not register cases of sexual violence against boys. And Strada actually did receive such reports. The age of victims ranged from 12 to 50, and the geographical coverage of victims included such regions as Kyiv, Kherson, Kharkiv, and Donetsk regions, but majority of cases were from Kyiv region, and also quite a few cases were from Kherson region. While it was occupied. As for the major tendencies which we can see from the pattern of how victims, the major problems which victims have with with reaching for assistance and with reporting the crime is, for example, the fact that general survivors are very reluctant to ask for assistance, any kind of assistance, including medical, psychological, social assistance, and even less willing to report to law enforcement. And here, to give an example of how reluctant victims are to receive assistance, I can refer to a case of a young man who suffered from sexual violence, actually from rape by Russian soldiers, a civilian man. And he was so ashamed to talk about his experience that he even refused to get medical assistance. We referred him to the medical organization, which is sort of volunteering medical organization, which does not need his personal details, so it would be wholly confidential. However, he still refused because he was too ashamed to talk about it to anyone. Another issue is that survivors from the occupied regions have difficulties with access to the hotlines or any other assistance, and these are the cases when we unfortunately could not do anything, could not refer victims to any law enforcement agency or any assistance service because they were still on the occupied territories, and the only thing we can do is to, of course, from by receiving consent of the victims to report the information to the law enforcement in order that at least law enforcement had this information. Another issue is that majority of victims are in very depressed psychological state, and this means that in many cases victims are suicidal, even in the circumstances when they have children, and the possibility to leave these children without parents. Another issue is an extensive negative consequences for survivors and their families. And here we are talking not about immediate consequences such as health-related issues, but also economical and social consequences, including for their families. So just to give you an idea of how far-reaching these consequences are, some victims needed rehabilitation services, addiction rehabilitation services for the members of their families because they became, like members of their families became addicted to alcohol and drugs because of the situation, because of what happens to the victims. So it's not only the victims themselves who need support and services, but also their family members. And of course, Kateryna already mentioned how it's different the range of services victims actually need. It's not only about psychological support or medical assistance. It's very, very different types of services. Another issue is a huge stigmatization within the family and community if the case of sexual violence becomes known. And this is a real problem because very, very often victims need assistance with relocation to another region in Ukraine or relocation to another country because it's still a very huge issue for them and for their families. So why are survivors reluctant to report? Again, it's from what our organization can see, like from communication with the victims. So it's not just assumptions; it's like really problems indicated by victims. So first of all, the victims mentioned deficiencies in the work of law enforcement. And deficiencies in the work of special services for the victims. So very often it's hard to reach law enforcement or reach specialized services, or specialized services do not have personnel which works with the victims, this specific category of victims. Another issue is deficiencies in criminal procedural legislation, meaning that we do not, in Ukraine, we do not currently have the separate provisions a separate procedure for treating victims of sexual violence, as for example, we can see from the rules of procedure and evidence of the statute of the role of the ICC. So it's such victims they require a separate set of rules and separate procedure for treating their criminal cases. Also, as I mentioned, it's the lack of gender sensitivity of law enforcement. And another problem which we see is the lack of awareness of survivors about what forms content-related sexual violence can take. That it is not only rape, but also different other forms, such as forced nudity, sexual harassment, sexualized tortures. And also it's lack of awareness of survivors about specialized services and algorithms of actions. And actually, Strada currently is taking actions in order to raise awareness about which specialized services are available and what are the algorithms of actions for people, for survivors who experience sexual violence, and also for witnesses of such violence. And I will talk about it in the next slides. And also, it's a lack of trust and fear of breach of confidentiality by services, by law enforcement who treat cases of victims of such violence. Also, very briefly about mechanisms of referral of sexual violence cases in Strada. So when an adult survivor reaches us, we need this person's consent to report the case to law enforcement, and unless a person asks us for that or gives us consent, we do not report due to considerations of anonymity and confidentiality. However, the situation is very different when it is a child survivor, meaning that the legislation obliges us to report such case to law enforcement without even consent of the survivor or his parents. And also, there are like it's two-way referral mechanism, meaning that we can report the case to law enforcement, and law enforcement can refer a person, a survivor, to us in order to be provided the survivor with further assistance. Also, as I mentioned, Strada has developed different informational materials for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, as well as specialized services. So, for example, these materials include the instructions on how to document the case of sexual violence, on where to report such case, on where to receive support, and how the witness can help the survivor to report the case and to receive support. And also algorithm for doctors, for medical personnel, on how to document such violence. Including on which legislative provisions exist in Ukraine and how they could use this provision in order to assist and the survivor and document the case. And the last thing I mentioned is Telegram chatbot. It was developed by Strada Ukraine in cooperation with the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine, and this chatbot was launched on 31st of October 2022. In this chatbot, survivors of conflict-related sexual violence or any other interested person can receive information on what this violence is and what kinds of assistance are available for survivors. And also, there is an opportunity to report, to fill a special form and report the case to the General Prosecutor's Office. And why we consider this important? So, like a little background, in Ukraine, General Prosecutor's Office, it launched the special website. It's called warcrimes.gov.ua, on which it is possible to report any war crime. Not only sexual violence, actually. However, there is a very limited, I would say, functionality of this website in terms of reporting specifically conflict-related sexual violence. So we think that the specialized chatbot would be much more gender sensitive and would allow much more the documentation of much more quality. And also one last thing I should mention is that Strada is currently very active in raising awareness of general public, of specialists working with victims of conflict-related sexual violence, and we are it's work in progress now. We are developing two courses which will be uploaded to the online platform Prometheus. And one of these courses is aimed at general public and educating general public on what conflict-related sexual violence is and how to document it, on how to communicate with victims and so on. And also another course will be for specialists, for different kinds of specialists working with victims. And it will be more like increasing their already existing knowledge on this issue, and providing more practical and specific information on how to work with this category of survivors. So that is all. Thank you for your attention, and I will be glad to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Yuliia. Thank you for highlighting the work that Strada are doing to sort of help survivors in this context, but also reminding us of the various challenges that survivors do face in coming forwards, and especially related to sort of legal enforcement and the challenges that individuals have in these circumstances. I'd like to thank you both as well for your very interesting presentations. I have a few questions prepared, but I'm also happy to take some from the audience as well. But I'll start off by asking a question about the fact finders. So we all three of us touched briefly upon the fact that there are people in Ukraine who are documenting the evidence of sexual violence and other forms of violence. I know, for example, from my own work in the Bosnian case, that there's a wealth of evidence of sexual violence, primarily originating from one report, which was the Basiuni report, which was commissioned in 1993, I believe, by the UN, to investigate reports of sexual violence originating from the country. The team responsible for this report interviewed 600 victims of sexual violence and compiled this huge report, which has a huge wealth of evidence of sexual violence and contributed towards the initial stages of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. So as I understand it, their methodology was primarily based on interviews with victims, survivors, and witnesses of sexual violence, and then built this evidence into the courts. And I was wondering if maybe Kateryna, you can start here, but what is happening in Ukraine regarding fact-finding missions? How are they collecting evidence, if you know, and what will sort of the end result of this evidence be?
Thank you very much, Bagan. I think, to be honest, to respond to this question, I should first just point out generally how the documentation of conflict-related crimes in Ukraine happens, because from that one will understand why any analysis of or any claim to have the holistic view of the patterns of crimes as well as the number of victims as of now is premature. Ukraine has a very active human rights NGO community who have been working on the ground since 2014, and as I said, who have been actually the first to refer the documented cases of conflict-related sexual violence to the ICC, even before the Prosecutor General's office efforts in 2017 and 2018. Currently, there are more than 50 domestic NGOs united in two big documentation coalitions. They're called, one coalition is called the Tribunal for Putin, the another coalition is called the 5 AM coalition, on the basis of the timing when the President Putin announced his so-called special military operation against Ukraine. This is only the wealth of actors on the NGO side domestically. This is, of course, also there's state documentation in Ukraine, and now there's a wealth of the ICC investigative teams coming on the ground, and also given the rise in the universal jurisdiction proceedings, there have been reports of, I think, French, Dutch investigative teams also coming on the ground to Ukraine. On top of that, there is, of course, the UN Commission of Inquiry and the larger office of the UN in the country working with survivors. That also is supplemented with a wealth of journalists going to the recently occupied areas, as well as with the rising number of the academic and journalistic documentation, also called oral history initiatives. Particularly the Reckoning Project by the group of famous journalists, and the project also co-led by the Yale University in partnership with Ukraine's human rights NGOs. So all of that, while it creates an important picture of crimes, also re-victimizes survivors greatly. Already in the Kyiv area, many human rights lawyers report that when they came to speak to survivors, not just sexual violence survivors, but generally survivors, in first April and May, and then when they came later in summer, and this includes my experience as well, not just the survivors, but their families were very reluctant and even angry to speak because they were approached by so many actors. And this is particularly poignant for sexual violence cases, because such over-interviewing impacts not only the integrity of evidence, it most importantly usually re-victimizes the survivor, and from what I have seen, gravely affects her, usually it was her, relationship with her family, who were really irritated by this excessive public attention. So what Ukraine is doing now to really be more survivor-centric, and by Ukraine I mean the state effort, but also the human rights community, they are trying to agree this, to harmonize their documentation policies, essentially first to figure out the thematic specialization of certain NGOs. For instance, those who documented violations against cultural heritage continue doing that and don't go to the new group of violations, especially with vulnerable victims. Also, there is a stronger line of passing the information about alleged survivors to domestic investigators and prosecutors to kind of let them do their job. And the ICC was also supportive of this because, as you know, the ICC jointly with Eurojust have issued the guidelines for the civil society on documenting atrocity, and their main message there is that don't document, don't interview, just refer the cases that you think you found to professional investigators and prosecutors. And also an important change has happened within Ukraine's Prosecutors General's office. They have developed the draft strategy of engaging with victims and witnesses of conflict-related sexual violence. It is not yet public, as I know, but I think the strategy addresses these two crucial issues of over-documentation and re-traumatization. So, sorry, it was a long response to say that I think both the government and the civil society are aware of this a re-traumatizing effect of their good effort, good documentation initiatives, and that is why they're trying to align it now to have a more sober, fact-based picture of sexual violence in Ukraine that doesn't hurt the victims.
Thank you. I think you really highlighted two very, very important points there of the re-traumatization effect and sort of over-documentation, which can lead to further re-traumatization in these contexts. And we've seen that in other conflicts as well, I think. Yuliia, do you have anything to add there, or are you happy to?
I think it's very exhaustive answer. Yeah, but maybe just one point from the perspective of the work of Strada is that from March till June, we received many huge number of requests from journalists, mostly foreign journalists, not independent journalists, asking us to refer to some victims, to find some victims and so on. But since the basis of our work is principles of anonymity and confidentiality, of course we could not, and we are promoting this approach among other organizations as well, because due to specifics of our work, of the work of our hotlines, we promote these principles for a very long time. But many others or other organizations do not have any policies or guidelines on this, so we have to promote this approach to all victims, including victims of conflict-related sexual violence.
Thank you. And I think it's important here to remember it's not just about numbers, right? It's about the individual stories and people feeling safe and secure in coming forward to talk about the violence that they've suffered. to kind of build on that a little bit, so we discussed earlier a bit about people who live in the occupied regions and the fact that they are struggling because there's no access to, for example, the hotlines that you were discussing, Yuliia. But also the fact that men are often more reluctant to come forward. So how do we address these sort of more marginalized groups that have been victim to sexual violence and encourage people to come forward to the correct agencies in the correct way? And do you have any sort of ideas about that? Perhaps we can start with you, Yuliia.
Well, there is no, I would say, universal recipes of how to do this, but of course, it's about change of attitude, of promoting more gender-sensitive approaches within specialized services. Just as an example, again, it's something we mentioned to the victims who hesitate whether to report a case to law enforcement. So, for example, in Ukraine, there is no definite provision on how many times a victim survivor can be interviewed by law enforcement agencies. And there was a practice, especially before this case occurred, that the victims were interviewed several times. However, since February, the General Prosecutor's Office developed some sort of practice to interview victims specifically of conflict-related sexual violence only once, and this interview is enough for any further legal proceedings. So we suggest victims not to go, if it is possible, not to go to local law enforcement agencies, law enforcement districts, but go to the General Prosecutor's Office because they will be interviewed only once. This is just an example, but there are many other problems which are still not addressed and which are preventing victims from reporting these crimes and from receiving assistance.
As Kateryna, as you pointed out, this sexual violence in Ukraine is not a new problem, and it's been continuing and ongoing since 2014, if not before. However, in the media in the UK, where I live, and in Norway, where we currently are, there are huge ebbs and flows in reporting of this violence. And the reporting of sexual violence in the UK started sort of in earnest in April, I would say. But there were reports earlier warning that this might happen or might be an aspect of this new invasion. Now the reporting of sexual violence in the Ukrainian context has arguably slightly eased off, but we know that the violence is continuing. So I was wondering how this is being reported in Ukraine. Is it prevalent in the media? How is sexual violence part of the discourse surrounding the conflict in Ukraine at the moment?
Thank you, Bergen. Well, actually, if I just may add a brief comment, I think actually the reports in the UK emerged quite early, because when Chatham House had this initial presentation of the idea of the special tribunal inaugurated by Foreign Minister Kuleba in very early March, already I remember this is the first time I, as a lawyer and a citizen, heard about the at least what he reported as mass accounts of sexual violence in occupied southern Kherson, the recently liberated area. And then actually the group of around five amazing female MPs who are really big change makers in Ukraine's parliament to the UK. I think they, for the first time, raised it with Boris Johnson then, the allegations of sexual violence. But as you rightly say, it was, those were more the, one of the time reports, but then the mass media reporting of that started slightly later in March and early in April. For Ukraine, many conflict-related crimes have become an unlikely catalyst of social change. So there has been a lot of empathy, at least that what I have noticed, among the general public in their reaction to this reporting but the sensitivity of the reporting is something that remains to be discussed. And the notorious case was with the previous ombudsperson of Ukraine, who, because perhaps of the lack of experience and because of the, the lack of these overdue guidelines about the sensitive communication of this type of violence, really reported these crimes perhaps a bit too explicitly, with a bit too much detail. And that was something that was picked up immediately by the human rights community and by the media community that report human rights issue. So what I was just wanted to say that in Ukraine domestically, on the one hand, there seems to be the great empathy on behalf of the people. Ukraine does not have, for instance, unlike Poland, the abortion, the issue with access to abortion in law. But in practice, of course, we understand, for instance, when the territories are liberated, the infrastructure around is destroyed. And the Human Rights Center Zmina, for instance, published the quotation from a sexual violence survivor who said that she didn't need any psychological support. She needed an abortion within 1 day because she didn't want to be absent from her village and raise suspicion, longer than 1 day. So at least with regards to the public perception, there has been much empathy, but with respect to the subtle and professional communication on behalf of the state authorities, this is something where there is room for improvement.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on that as well, actually. So again, in sort of the UK context, sexual violence against men and boys in Ukraine has been reported, but I would argue that it's been reported in a sense that it's exceptional. It's not part of the everyday conflict, and it's something that only happens in certain places at certain times. And also that it's not many people are suffering it. At least that's kind of the reporting as it's coming out. And again, I was wondering how this form of violence has been addressed in sort of Ukrainian public discourse, and how we've seen it referred to as sexual violence, torture, or something else entirely. Perhaps both of you have a comment here.
If I can start. First of all, the problem of sexual violence against men and also boys, it was so the issue was relevant even since 2014 because there were cases of, especially of sexual violence against Ukrainian military, and these cases were very rarely reported, and even our organization actually, like in 2017 approximately, we received a call from a mother of a Ukrainian soldier who was castrated, and she told that her son was it happened in 2014 or 2015, but she was so devastated that she committed a suicide. So it's very I would say effects which are very long term and like not immediately seen. And actually there were cases of castration and other forms of sexual violence against men in Ukraine. So my point is that these cases are not new, and probably now they are continuing. And as I mentioned, for example, our organization, since February, we did not receive any reports from Ukrainian military who were subjected to sexual violence, but from boys and young men among civilians. And they were very, very reluctant to talk about it, to seek any assistance, much more reluctant than even women. So our current efforts are aimed at raising awareness, especially among specialists working with such cases, to teach them to identify these cases, even if people are not talking about this directly, to educate about signs, how they can notice them, and to subsequently provide support. And as for issue of how to distinguish between torture and sexual violence and what is the problem here, actually it's one of the aspects of my current research. And for example, I analyzed several dozens of reports from 2014 by different international organizations and also NGOs, and it is very often there is a bias towards calling sexual violence or sexualized torture only as torture, and this bias is especially seen when the aim of the report is to document cases of torture. So there is a task for certain reports, there is a certain aim for certain report. So they mention even only details which pertain to torture and omit the details pertaining to sexual violence. Or even if these details are mentioned, they do not call it as a separate offense of sexual violence, for example. However, I should mention that the situation changed, slightly changed since the new phase of war from February. And it's more likely that sexualized torture will be at least, there will be at least some reference that this might constitute sexual violence. And one of the explanation I can see is that, first of all, it's much more different patterns of sexual violence now. So there is more incentive to be more attentive to classify, to separating different forms of sexual violence. And also, since the scale of such violence is bigger, and resources and personnel of this organization, they allocate bigger resources to writing these reports. So probably because of that, the quality of these reports in terms of detecting sexual violence and calling it sexual violence is also better now. At least it's explanations I can do.
Thank you. We have a little over 5 minutes left of our time, so I wanted to turn to see if anyone in the audience has any questions they would like to ask at this point. Yeah, we have a couple, so we'll just, I don't know if you can see the audience, but we'll pass the microphone around. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for the insightful talks. I have actually 3 questions. So first, I was wondering, you have mentioned that it's difficult to analyze already the things, it's premature to analyze what we're seeing, but still, could you comment if you see this sexual violence as something very systematic and sanctioned type of warfare? That would be first. Secondly, we have also heard reports about human trafficking with regards to sexual exploitation of people who are in vulnerable situations. If you could comment a bit on that, if you have any information. And third one was about dehumanization. You mentioned that's also an aspect that is accompanying the sexual violence. Is this speech of dehumanization only based in narratives about denazification of Ukraine, or is there some other aspects that add to that, that are employed? So yeah, that would be, thank you.
Perhaps we can start with Kateryna. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for the very insightful questions. I think the intention and the scale, again, is something that is to be assessed. So, for instance, as we discussed previously, at least it would be only currently, I think, the investigators and prosecutors who would know, for instance, the scope of sexual violence used against Ukrainian men, especially the service male, the prisoners, the men who were prisoners of war, right? Because this is not as widely in the public domain, for instance, as the violence against women. I think what's the guide, I would rather comment on the guiding sources, on the pathways to answering this question, and look first at the tolerance of sexual violence and towards violence in Russia. You probably have heard about the European Court of Human Rights cases regarding the victims who were horrifically victimized with their hands cut off in the cases against Russia, as well as the notorious non-criminalization of domestic violence and the strong opposition to adopting the domestic legislation on countering domestic violence in Russia. Russia. And I think these are the indicators that could at least speak about the worrying tolerance towards violence and violence against women, and that combined, for instance, with the intercepted communications allegedly of the Russian service people between themselves and with their families, where their own family members would encourage violence, including violence against Ukrainian women, and that combined also with the hateful rhetoric that accompanies the crime, I think that could at least speak about the high degree of tolerance towards this type of conflict-related violations, including to the Ukrainian women. And it's also not by chance that it was the video of castration that appeared, not on some other violations, I think. Could you, because I think kind of covered much in this response, or would there be something more specific you would want me to address further?
No, we're fine. We can move on to this.
Thank you.
Yuliia, do you?
Sure. About the first question, whether conflict-related sexual violence is used as a weapon of war in Ukraine. So again, I agree with Kateryna that before we know the full picture, including numbers and geographical coverage and so on, it's very difficult. But from the point of view of law, like whether sexual violence is used as a weapon of war or whether it is just opportunistic acts, it's not that relevant for law as for some social sciences. And what concerns us is in law is the level of intent. So meaning that if it was something planned before the war, so because of it was planned, now it's been used as a strategy of war, or it is just some like lack of interest by commanders to what is happening, and their consequent a decision not to intervene if Russian soldiers just are committing it. So basically, what I want to say, it's according to law, it's in the level of intent, which will be determined in subsequent legal proceedings when certain criminal acts of certain people will be investigated. And it is very important to currently Ukraine in its legislation, it does not have a specific provision about common responsibility or superior responsibility, which is important to attribute this level of intent to a specific perpetrator. So it's a problem, a legislative problem currently in the national legislation as well. As for human trafficking, since Strada is working on this issue as well, I can also comment. What we see now is that like less, I would say less victims report human trafficking than even before the war, but this is the phase of the war, but it is not a sign that human trafficking diminished or doesn't happen. I would say that it is becoming more latent, and it is much harder to trace, especially considering that so many people are left the country and living abroad now. And for Ukrainian authorities, of course, it is more difficult to trace these cases. So I would say that currently it's responsibility, more of responsibility of European authorities in the countries in which Ukrainian refugees are living to try to trace and prevent such cases. And also concerning the humanization speech, again, it's very important, and Strada tries to highlight the importance of documenting all the patterns of speech in the cases of rapes or other cases of sexual violence. So it's very important to document, to write down, like in every case, what specific language the perpetrators used in order to make it like in the future to put it in the legal proceedings, for example, on genocide or other legal proceedings. So it's important to document any details which might be relevant.
Thank you very much. I think we are out of time unless someone has a very quick question, but okay, so I would like to say thank you so much to both of you for all of your insights, to Dorothee for helping organize and for just being great, and to everyone here for sort of participating and being here to listen to this really important event, I think. So thank you so much, and
Yeah, thank you also from my side, also you, Anna, for being the discussant for this event. I think we all got so many new, very important insights in this topic. And yeah, also from my side, thank you so much to both of you joining via Zoom. It would be lovely to welcome you one day here in person, maybe for another event. And thank you also for the audience, both in person and online. For the in-person audience outside, if you not have already seen it, we have some coffee and some sandwiches. So feel free to grab some, enjoy the time out there, and maybe you have follow-up questions. In case you have follow-up questions to one of our panelists, feel free to contact either Anna or me, and we are very happy to forward the questions then to whoever it concerns. Either it's an open question, then we can forward it to both, or you let us know specifically who you would like to be addressed then in this question. So once again, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you here, and I hope to see you again anytime soon.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you.